Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm a wandering amnesiac found in the forest. Please take me home and give me a name based on how I'm behaving right at this moment. But really, I'm Alistair Stevens. We're just going to be talking a lot about the story of Túrin Turambar tonight, fellow Silmarillion heirs. In fact, we're going to conclude, hopefully, the story of Túrin Turambar, the second of Tolkien's great stories of the Elder Days. So buckle up for angst and despair, for dragons and for destruction, for the fall of Nargothrond, almost casually, like off to the side, the fall of Nargothrond, and for as many new names as there are character deaths. I'm not completely sure that that's mathematically rigorous, but they're certainly in the same ballpark, and those numbers are not insignificant. Before we get to that, a quick update, just because I am a man flawed in the world. Gray, green, blue, purple, and orange, of course, are the ascending colors of rarity in items in World of Warcraft, the popular multiplayer online role-playing game. It bothered me so much after last week's show that I could not immediately call to mind. I played WoW for like 5 or 6 years. I played WoW for a long time and really enjoyed the lore of that game, and it was surprising to me that I could no longer remember that particular color sequence. So common, uncommon, rare, epic, legendary, gray, green, blue, purple, and orange, and now at last my work is discharged and I can rest. We've got Galadriel Becky and Glorfin David joining us here in the chat tonight. I'm realizing that both my mic and my shirt are a little hot because I'm a man who put on a flannel on an 85-degree day to record a podcast in a studio which is not, let's say, sufficiently air-conditioned. But that's all right. We can get through it. We can get into our discussion of Túrin Turambar. Last week, we learned of Túrin, son of Hurin, fostered into the household of King Thingol in Menegroth, right there in Doriath, within the girdle of Melian, one of the safest places in all of Beleriand, even now. Túrin goes to the front lines with Beleg Strongbow, then returns to Menegroth and accidentally kills the elf Cyros for talking smack about his family, and then, as anyone would, declares himself an outlaw and becomes an outlaw, because that seems to be the natural career progression for someone like Túrin Turambar. He embarks on this career of lawlessness with the man known as the Wolfmen, the Gowerwaith. Beleg then returns to Menegroth and receives as a gift from King Thingol the black sword Anglachel, forged by Eol the Dark Elf. Nothing bad could happen to that sword, surely. He then joins up with Túrin again and cleanses the western region of Beleriand of evil. Túrin takes his second new name, Gorthaul, the Dread Helm, and eventually is betrayed by Mime, the petty dwarf, and taken captive in Angband, which is where we are going to pick up our story this week. But before we do, I want to take just a moment to frame out our discussion, because I've been thinking a lot, as you might expect, about Túrin Turambar this week, about this story, about its position in the Legendarium, about that odd tonal or rhetorical schism between this story and the others that appear in the bound volume of the Silmarillion and through the Legendarium in general. What sets this story apart, and the consequence of that differentiation? Because we're going to be talking a lot about the bad choices of Túrin Turambar, right? And this is not our first time talking about bad choices within the frame of the Silmarillion, because this is a book that is oriented around the bad choices of one Feanor, son of Finwë. And as we discuss Túrin's position in the world, as we discuss the degree to which Túrin is responsible, perhaps, for what happens to him, certainly the degree to which Túrin is laboring under the direct and intentional curse of Morgoth in a way that, honestly, not even Feanor was, as we discuss his position and his relationship to morality and the broader kind of ethical schematic in Middle-earth, certainly, but also the broader kind of philosophical schematic of Middle-earth. As we consider that position, I want to give some thought to how the origin of the Túrin Turambar story changes our understanding of who he is as a hero, of what his heroic virtues are, if indeed he is in possession of any heroic virtues. I want to consider how this story plays out positioned next to, we're going to get this great moment in this story when Gwyndor, I believe it is, compares Túrin directly to Beren, right? He finds Túrin lacking. Túrin is no Beren, of course. And I find it almost impossible to believe that these two men would even identify each other as living in the same world. So I want to consider this as we move forward. This is, I think, the reading more than any other in the Legendarium that really stresses our understanding of the terroir from which Tolkien originates his stories, right? The ground in which these particular vines grow and ripen and yield their fruit is very different, and that gives us a different perspective in terms of understanding Túrin as a protagonist versus barren or Tuor, as we're going to see in readings to come, right? And certainly contraposed with Aragorn, right? And the other heroic figures of the Lord of the Rings and the later aspects of the Legendarium. So I want to be aware of that as we move through tonight and kind of try to position Túrin in terms of his own story, but yes, given our, aesthetic perspective on this entire work, I want to continue to try to understand him from the point of view of the Silmarillion as a single bound, unified mythology. And see if that's even possible. We'll find out as we progress. Let's get into our reading tonight then, as I call up our first of many, many slides, and let's see how this works out. Now Beleg was sorely wounded, but he was mighty among the elves of Middle-earth, and he was moreover a master of healing. Therefore he did not die, and slowly his strength returned, and he sought in vain among the dead for Túrin to bury him. But he found him not, and then he knew that Hurin's son was yet alive, and taken to Angband. With little hope, Beleg departed from Amon Ruth and set out northward toward the crossings of Teiglin, following in the track of the orcs. And he crossed over the Brithiach and journeyed through Dimbar toward the pass of Anach. And now he was not far behind them, for he went without sleeping, whereas they had tarried on the road, hunting in the lands and fearing no pursuit as they came northward. And not even in the dreadful woods of Tarnufuin did he swerve from their trail, for the skill of Beleg was greater than any that have been in Middle-earth. But as he passed by night through the evil land, he came upon one lying asleep at the foot of a great dead tree. And Beleg, staying his steps beside the sleeper, saw that it was an elf. Then he spoke to him and gave him lembas and asked him what fate had brought him, to this terrible place. And he named himself Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn. And Tarnufuin, for those of you who have not been keeping up with your Beleriand geography as you ought, is of course just the other name for northern Dorthonion, that region between the mountains of the arid Gorgoroth to the south and the hills of Ladros to the north, beyond which is the Anfauglith, the desert of Morgoth leading to Angband itself. Tarnufuin is Sindarin for forest under night. Interestingly, in the Noldoran phase of the language, it was spelled Tower Na Fuin, right, as opposed to Tower Nu Fuin, Tower Na Fuin, meaning forest of night rather than forest under night. But both seem to be pretty appropriate for a fairly rough place. This, then, is Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, brother to Gelmir, who is so graphically cut into pieces by the orcs in front of the battle lines of Fingon's army in the northwest prior to the Battle of Unnumbered Tears. He's one of the very few elves, if you recall, that go forth from Nargothrond to take part in what turns into the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. Gwyndor here appearing as an escapee from the notoriously porous prison of Angband in the north. So we're positioning Beleg here. Well, we already have positioned Beleg as a real hero, I think, but we're positioning Beleg here as an interesting figure because we are now noting his exceptional skill. This is not the first time we've observed that he's a master of healing, of course. He comes to the Wolfmen, the outlaws under Túrin's command, and heals them too, so readily, with in part the lembas given to him by Melian. But in addition to his mastery of healing, we're now learning that no one is better at woodcraft, at stealth, effectively. No one is a better hunter in Middle-earth than Beleg Strongbow. We're kind of positioning him here as a kind of classic ranger archetype. I'm taking ranger from the D&D inspiration there rather than the Tolkienian inspiration a little more readily, but he's peculiarly skilled at moving through the forests. And one of the consequences of that, I think, of our understanding of Beleg now is that we are isolating him. We're kind of isolating him in his exceptionality, right? We're kind of isolating him in his moral strength, in his judgment, in his application of principle, right? He did not abandon Túrin, even though he had cause to. He has remained faithful to this human boy that he professes to love. It's a powerful story that is going to reach its tragic conclusion all too soon. So as Beleg is pursuing the orcs that have taken Túrin all the way through Tarnufuin, he stays with them and finds Gwyndor, and we have this brief reintroduction of us, I guess, an introduction to them for the first time. Grieving, Beleg looked upon him, for Gwyndor was now a bent and fearful shadow of his former shape and mood, when in the Nirnaeth Arnodiad that lord of Nargothrond rode with rash courage to the very doors of Angband, and there was taken. For few of the Noldor whom Morgoth captured were put to death, because of their skill in forging and in mining for metals and gems, and Gwyndor was not slain, but put to labour in the mines of the north. By secret tunnels known only to themselves, the mining elves might sometimes escape, and thus it came to pass that Beleg found him, spent and bewildered in the mazes of Tower Nufuin. And Gwyndor told him that as he lay and lurked among the trees, he saw a great company of orcs passing northwards, and wolves went with them, and among them was a man whose hands were chained, and they drove him onwards with whips. Very tall he was, said Gwyndor, as tall as are the men from the misty hills of Hithlum. Then Beleg told him of his own errand in Tarnafuin, and Gwyndor sought to dissuade him from his quest, saying that he would but join Túrin in the anguish that awaited him. But Beleg would not abandon Túrin, and despairing himself, he aroused hope again in Gwyndor's heart, and together they went on, following the orcs until they came out of the forest on the high slopes that ran down to the barren dunes of Anfaglith. There, within sight of the peaks of Thangordrim, the orcs made their encampment in a bare dell as the light of day was failing, and setting wolf sentinels all about, they fell to carousing. A great storm rode up out of the west, and lightning glittered on the shadowy mountains far away as Beleg and Gwyndor crept toward the dell. So a fairly straightforward account of Gwyndor's capture and then escape. But again, as we mentioned last week, of course, when I was making jokes about the poor security of Morgoth's prison guards, it is, we are told within the pages of the Silmarillion, to Morgoth's pleasure that some of the elves just escape. That some of the elves can return home and be rejected by their kith and kin, be rejected by their own communities, by their own homes, because those elves who have not been to Angband cannot trust that the elves who return are legitimate escapees and not spies sent by Morgoth himself. This is all, of course, to Morgoth's design and to Morgoth's pleasure. So Gwyndor accounts for the passing of the orc horde. I don't know exactly what the technical term, but a company, I suppose, right, is a fairly numerically neutral term here for the passing of these orcs. A great company of orcs passing northwards, and wolves went with them, and among them was a man. He stands out. Very tall he was, says Gwyndor, as tall as the men from the misty hills of Hithlum, with whom, of course, Gwyndor would be familiar because of fighting alongside them in the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. So Beleg says, I myself am crossing through Tarnafuin in pursuit of this man who seems to be from Hithlum, and Gwyndor sought to dissuade him from his quest, saying that he would but join Túrin in the anguish that awaited him. But Beleg would not abandon Túrin, and despairing himself, he aroused hope again in Gwyndor's heart. Kind of setting aside his own need, setting aside his own pace, setting aside his own drive, setting aside the immediacy of his mission, the time sensitivity of his mission, his commitment here kindles something within Gwyndor. It kindles a new hope within Gwyndor, who is, as we're told, that first line, right, a bent and fearful shadow of his former shape and mood. He was a Lord of Nargothrond, and we're going to hit this beat a few times from a few different perspectives. Túrin is going to have a perspective on this, and, when we get back to Nargothrond, Finduilas is certainly going to have a somewhat unfortunate perspective. Gwyndor is going to be a really interesting character through this week's reading, because Gwyndor comes to a place of such enormous wisdom, such enormous, positive connotation, sagacity, right? Not just the argumentative philosophical kind of sagacity that we've discussed before in the pages of Tolkien, but a genuine thoughtfulness and consideration hard-earned through suffering and cruelty, right? His experience has been alchemically transformed into a kind of wisdom and a kind of gentleness that nonetheless is capable of being transformed, of being kindled, as Beleg does here, into strength. So they follow in the footsteps of the orcs, and they're within sight of Thangordrim, right? Within sight of the peaks of Thangordrim, the orcs make their encampment in a bare dell because they're traveling slowly. Why are they traveling slowly? Because they have no reason to do otherwise. They're not hustling back to Thangordrim. They're not hustling back to Angband with Túrin because they fear that they are being pursued. They know that they are not being pursued, somewhat incorrectly, but also generally completely correctly, right? They know that there is no armed military force giving chase to them, so they just travel easy. They carouse and they hunt. They stop within sight of home to drink, to pass this stormy evening away. But this stormy evening has more in it, perhaps, right? A great storm rose out of the west, and lightning glittered in the shadowy mountains far away as Beleg and Gwyndor crept toward the dell. We're going to lampshade this storm from the west in just a moment from the unexpected POV of the orcs. But even here, right, we've been reading Tolkien long enough. We've been reading the Silmarillion. Lord knows, this is episode 20. We've been reading the Silmarillion these last 20 weeks, and we are now conditioned. A great storm rode up out of the west, which is not just powerful in itself, but also this is occurring in the immediate aftermath of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad. And you'll remember that at the end of that chapter, another similar storm blew up out of the west to as we saw in that moment, little understandable effect. It's unclear why that great wind blew out of the west at the end of the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, but this one seems to have a more immediate effect, for sure. And of course, we are thinking of Manwë. Of course, we're thinking of the Valar. Of course, we're thinking of Aman and Valinor. And this isn't the first time that the West has appeared with that, like, I know that it's lowercase on this slide, but there is a kind of implied capital W here to these inclusions of the West. We have that great storm out of the West at the end of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad in the previous chapter, but we also have Túrin looking westward the first time that he parts from Beleg Strongbow, right? When he's looking west to Amon Ruth, and he gains in that moment the foresight that when Beleg wants to find him, that is where he will be. It's when he's finally drawing close to Amon Ruth, it's the westering sun that reveals the red flowers of Saragon, on the summit, which leads to one of Túrin's men to say, there is blood on the hilltop, which is also, of course, prophetic. So we're associating the West, in the particular instance of Túrin Turambar, we're associating the West with prophecy, with foresight, and with a kind of sense of doom. Because that's... Well, I wanted to go further before we got into this, but I guess we can get into this now. Because that is one of the things with Túrin Turambar, right? That is one of the things that makes his story and its derivation from the Finnish, from the Norse, from the Old German. It makes our understanding of prophecy and of doom and of fate slightly different than our understanding of how those forces operate in the rest of the Legendarium, because we're not unfamiliar with prophecy. We're not unfamiliar with foresightedness. We're not unfamiliar with, the visions that come to those on the moment of death, or the visions that come to those who carry, ancient and noble blood within their veins. We get the sense that foresightedness almost always plays out, but it's a kind of gift. It's a kind of reward almost. Foresightedness is almost always a good thing in most of Tolkien's Legendarium. It may not come to good, right? This is still a fairly bleak story, but it may not be immediately condemning. But when Túrin suffers from foresight, when Túrin has these moments where he's looking out, to Amon Ruth, when he's seeing the red Saragon on the top of Amon Ruth, these moments of foresight are all doom which could be avoided. They are all bloody promises of what will come. And even when he's in Amon Ruth, right? You'll remember that passage where he's in Amon Ruth and he's looking around. He's kind of enjoying the evening air, and he keeps looking north to Amon Obol, which is going to be so significant in this week's reading, right? He keeps looking north to where he will eventually be in this story. And it feels again like this is the bleak promise. This is the bleak foreshadowing. It's almost as though the foresight of Túrin is a temptation to the worst side of his fate, the worst side of his doom, the worst side of his luck almost. And it feels very different. So when we're invoking the West, specifically in the story of Túrin Turambar, I'm not willing to completely separate ourselves away from it's Manwë. It's a storm. It's a cleansing wind. It's a storm that will actually be extremely helpful to Beleg Calathian in this moment. I'm not completely willing to separate that and to distinguish between the two, but there is also this sense of a doom that can be avoided, right? Gwyndor is almost telling Túrin through tonight's reading that you can change this. It doesn't have to be this way. You are, yes, laboring under a powerful curse, but the consequence of that curse, or the realization of that curse, the enactment of that curse, is going to be yours. You are going to make this happen, you dumb man. We'll see how we feel about that when we get to those particular readings. Let's get back to our slides as we push on and take a look at... Let's take a moment. Let's get back to our slides and take a look at the most tragic event possibly in the Silmarillion so far. Just a moment of awful and casual emotional cruelty, right? This is just a terrible thing that has happened. It's probably not the most terrible thing that has happened thus far, right? We have Eol and we have Maeglen and we have the death of Adethal, which is so terrible to read. And we have, of course, the kinslaying at Alqualondë. We have the murder of all of those Teleri. We have the burning of the swan boats of Alqualondë too, right? Terrible things have happened. But this is one of the most terrible for its position in our kind of rhetorical strata here. Right? We've talked about this before, that the closer we get to the ground, the more immediately these things hit, the more naturalistic they are. Oftentimes, if you are a modern fan of fantasy literature, you will find yourself in a conversation where either rhetorically or quite literally you are presented with a spectrum of modern fantasy, with Professor Tolkien at one end and modern dark fantasy George R.R. Martin style at the other. And we're presented this as though this is a fundamental dichotomy, right? As though, and the casual reader, of course, will believe this sometimes, but those of us who have read more, I think, can usually find our way through this labyrinth to the true meaning of what Tolkien is intending. But you will hear these allegations that Tolkien writes simplistic books, that the good guys are all good and the bad guys are all bad, and that there's really no complexity or like emotional nuance or like weight or challenge, that decisions are easy and heroism is straightforward. We know that that is not true, but to the modern fantasy reader, I think that is often how Professor Tolkien's work is interpreted. Whereas George R.R. Martin, I mean, Game of Thrones is so like grimy and gritty and dirty and no one's easy and no one's uncompromised and everything is complex and interesting. I challenge you to find anything in George R.R. Martin as bleak as the story of Túrin Turambar or as philosophically complex, particularly in its intertextual position with the rest of its own kind of host legendarium, right? I challenge you to find anything as complex in the pages of George R.R. Martin's series, which is not to say anything critical about George R.R. Martin. I'm glad we have different kinds of fantasy for sure, and I enjoyed the first few novels of Game of Thrones a great deal. I have yet to see the last season of that show because everyone said it was bad. But with that, let's get back to Beleg and Gwyndor attacking the orc encampment under the cover of the storm. When all in the camp were sleeping, Beleg took his bow and in the darkness shot the wolf sentinels one by one and silently. Then in great peril they entered in, and they found Túrin fettered, hand and foot, and tied to a withered tree, and all about him knives that had been cast at him were embedded in the trunk, and he was senseless in a sleep of great weariness. But Beleg and Gwyndor cut the bonds that held him, and lifting him they carried him out of the dell, yet they could bear him no further than to a thicket of thorn trees a little way above. There they laid him down, and now the storm drew very near. Beleg drew the sword Anglachel, and with it he cut the fetters that bound Túrin. But fate was that day more strong, for the blade slipped as he cut the shackles, and Túrin's foot was pricked. Then he was aroused into a sudden wakefulness of rage and fear, and seeing one bending over him with naked blade, he leapt up with a great cry, believing that orcs were come again to torment him, and grappling with them in the darkness, he seized Anglachel, and slew Beleg Cuthalion, thinking him a foe. But as he stood, finding himself free and ready to sell his life dearly against imagined foes, there came a great flash of lightning above them, and in its light he looked down on Beleg's face. Then Túrin stood stone still and silent, staring on that dreadful death, knowing what he had done, and so terrible was his face, lit by the lightning that flickered all about them, that Gwyndor cowered down upon the ground and dared not raise his eyes. But now in the dell beneath the orcs were aroused, and all the camp was in a tumult, for they feared the thunder that came out of the west, believing it was sent against them by the great enemies beyond the sea. Then a wind arose, and great rains fell, and torrents swept down from the heights of Tar Nufuin, and though Gwyndor cried out to Túrin, warning him of their utmost peril, he made no answer, but sat unmoving and unweeping in the tempest beside the body of Beleg Cuthalion. The opening sequence here is very open world video game. It's very, Assassin's Creed. This is the the Ubisoft adaptation of the summer. Beleg, take out the lookouts. Press RB to enter stealth mode. One by one, taking out the wolf sentinels, one by one and silently. Then entering in and presumably mashing X to free Túrin's fettered hands, right? Taking him from this place where we get this detail that all about him, knives that had been cast at him were embedded in the trunk, and he was senseless in a sleep of great weariness. The orcs have been playing with Túrin. They have been tormenting him. They have literally been hurling knives at him, and we presume that not all of them missed, right? Túrin has really been through it, which is partly, of course, the explanation for what happens next. This, it might be argued, is the first real turning point in Túrin's life, the first real moment when the curse of Morgoth comes upon him and is fully realized. Yes, there's the death of Cyros, right, for which Túrin is at least partly culpable, setting him to run naked through the forest until he falls into a stream and breaks his body on the rocks. And certainly it's Túrin's bad luck that all of this is witnessed, right? And he doesn't really take the time to offer explanation here. But this is incontrovertible. This is doom in both senses of the word. And there's also that twisted, awful sense of luck, right? This is going to be another recurring thing that we're going to track in the story of Túrin Turambar that I don't think we get in other tragic stories within the Legendarium. There is this turn of a kind of Norse sense of sour luck, right? It's not that Túrin doesn't kill Balig here. Túrin kills Balig here, and it is awful and tragic. But in that moment, he is struck dumb by the horror of what he has done. The storm coming in from the west here, right? Yes, absolutely. Shrouding Balig and Gwyndor as they go into the orc camp, absolutely. And then, as we're told, as we'll get to in just a moment, kind of frightening the orcs so that they are aroused and in a tumult, but they're also upset. They're also not thinking clearly. They're also maybe not taking careful stock of what has happened. We get the great rains falling and the torrents sweeping down from the heights of Tarnafuan, among other things, erasing the tracks of Balig and Gwyndor and Túrin here into this little copse of trees just a little way away from the orc camp. But it is mostly and most conspicuously the stupefaction here of Túrin Turambar that keeps him free, that keeps him safe, because the orcs don't believe that he would be so nearby. So when they range out, as we'll see in the next slide, when they range out, they range further afield, believing that he would have fled, which is, of course, what he would have done had he not inadvertently killed his friend. And the reason that he knows he has killed his friend is, again, additionally, with a twist, the introduction of the storm. It is the lightning that reveals what he has done. So we have, in both senses here, from both perspectives, I think, both the terrible, tragic, awful, calamitous misfortune of Túrin Turambar, right? The unhappiness of Túrin Turambar, using happy there in the classical sense of luck. The unhappiness of Túrin Turambar, but also this weird twist of good fortune, where he's not just stoically enduring the tragedy, but he has reason to believe that the tragedy has a kind of silver lining to it, that there's something in his luck that makes him believe that maybe he's not completely on the wrong path, and that is going to keep happening as we move through his story. And I think that is distinct from, Beren doesn't have to deal with that. Beren is very clear when he is facing good fortune and ill fortune, right? His story is very stark in that respect. The same can be said of Feanor. Certainly the same can be said of, Finrod Felagund as he's helping Beren. Most of our kind of ground level protagonists, as we've been moving through the story, have had that kind of clear luck. What is bad and what is good, and it's easy to tell the difference between. Túrin is in a completely different kind of story. I am fascinated here by the idea of the orcs viewing the Valar, of whom they've only ever heard rumor, we imagine, right, as the enemies beyond the sea, capital E, capital S. I really love how that's presented, because we don't get much insight into Morgoth's domestic propaganda campaigns, right? We can imagine that part of maintaining his control over his forces in the north is through narrative. We believe that is true, because that's, of course, how Morgoth exerts much of his will across Beleriand, and prior to coming into Beleriand, across the wider world. He tells stories, he twists the truth, he creates a convincing narrative that compels people to take action, even when they think that they are rejecting it, right? You'll remember all the way back when we were told that Feanor never listened to Morgoth at all, except that Feanor also conveniently believes many of the lies that Morgoth has planted in the Noldor population back in Aman. I find it interesting to consider how Morgoth lies to the orcs under his command, whether it's necessary to lie to the Balrogs and Glaurung, for example, right? The Maya level creatures under his command. I was reading this week through the Children of Húrin, right? Through the single volume version of the many attempts that the professor made to write this story down. And I was struck by Morgoth attempting to sway Húrin by telling him more than once that, in fact, the fate of men, that they are strangers here, and that the souls of men depart the earth upon their death, is not a gift of Iluvatar. It doesn't make them special. It makes them hollow. It makes their life meaningless, that there is nothing after this world, and that when they die, the souls of men simply die too, which is such a fantastic lie. It is such, within the cosmological schematic that Tolkien gives us here, it is so great that Morgoth takes this thing that the elves don't know, that the Valar themselves don't know, what happens to man after this, and just decides, no, I can just tell them that nothing happens after this, because that will torment them at the very least, and may even bring them to my side. If I tell them that there's no life after this, then they might as well enjoy life in my service, Galadriel Becky says, it's like there's an invisible battle between Morgoth and Manwë for Túrin's fate. Becky, I think that's so interesting. I think that is... Because you're absolutely right. There is an observable, I think, and verifiable presence of Morgoth in the life of Túrin, right? We're going to get a couple of moments. Glaurung is going to be dispatched on a weird errand that only makes sense if Morgoth is paying very close attention to what Túrin is doing and what is important to him. We had that weird, we'll get to it because I've written it down in my notes a little later, but we'll get to that weird moment of elevated rhetoric that we had in last week's reading. You'll remember that what mortal minds can know the mysteries of Morgoth as he, observes all of Middle-earth. He who was Melkor of the great and wise, we get all of that heightened rhetoric about how smart and wise and capable Morgoth is, and we get nothing of the Valar, right? We get the moment of Ulmo warning everybody to maybe just go hide in Nargothrond. Don't listen to Túrin. He's not going to lead you well. But we don't get the presence of the Valar in the same way. And that's fascinating, right? It's so interesting because to kind of expand this out and to look at the rest of the Legendarium, that is kind of the role that Eru Ilúvatar occupies. That is where we situate him. We're never clear what is Ilúvatar. We're never clear, whether there is direct intercession in these stories, whether there are moments of I guess, an active grace, rather than just the crack that lets the light come in. It's difficult to determine that, but you're right. I think we see, for example, this storm, and we feel the presence of Manwë, right? A storm comes in from the west, we're thinking Manwë. We're good readers of the Silmarillion, we have that in our heads. But then look at how it plays out. On the one hand, yes, it shrouds Beleg and Gwyndor as they come into the orc camp, but on the other, reveals to Túrin what he has done. But on a hypothetical third hand, also protects Túrin because he is stupefied by the enormity of this tragedy, and that preserves him from the orc hunting parties. So we're in this very complicated place where each of these actions is kind of playing both sides almost. There's a sense... perhaps not so much that Túrin is caught in a tug of war between, Manwë and Morgoth, the forces of good on one side, the forces of bad on the other, that it's not a simple linear progression from the one to the other, but it's more like a tornado. It's more like a maelstrom. Just everyone is throwing everything they've got into this story, and everything is having multiple effects. Everything, it's if you're playing like a collectible card game, if you're playing a Magic, or you're playing some kind of, a lot of game talk in this week's session. It's strange how this works. Anything to avoid the tragedy of Túrin Turambar, I suppose. But it's like if you're playing like a very complicated collectible card game, and someone puts down a card, and you're like, oh, all right, it's going to take a moment, and you work out all the various, consequences of that one play and how to play them out in order. It's actually a kind of game that I like a lot. I'm not a big Magic player. I don't know if you guys are Magic players. I always feel like I should be. I feel that it is a quirk of fate that I am not big into Magic the Gathering, but I'm not, to the degree that I've basically never played it. So there's so much time out there to learn new card games. Let's move on and get to let's continue our tragedy and talk a little more about Túrin here and how we bury Beleg. When morning came, the storm was passed away eastward over Lochlan, and the sun of autumn rose hot and bright. But believing that Túrin would have fled far away from that place, and all trace of his flight be washed away, the orcs departed in haste without longer search, and far off Gwyndor saw them marching away over the steaming sands of Anfauglith. Thus it came to pass that they returned to Morgoth empty-handed, and left behind the son of Húrin, who sat crazed and unwitting on the slopes of Tar Nafuin, bearing a burden heavier than their bonds. Then Gwyndor roused Túrin to aid him in the burial of Beleg, and he rose as one that walked in sleep. And together they laid Beleg in a shallow grave, and placed beside him Belthronding his great bow that was made of black yew wood. But the dread sword Anglachel Gwyndor took, saying that it were better that it should take vengeance on the servants of Morgoth than lie useless in the earth. And he took also the Lembas of Melian to strengthen them in the wild. crucial here, I think, that it is Gwyndor that takes up Anglachel, because Túrin taking up Anglachel here would be very different, right? The valence of that moral decision is very different. There's a practicality. There is, as we attribute to Gwyndor so often here in the wake of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad and his suffering in Angband, there is a wisdom to Gwyndor that would, I think, be read as something more insensitive, bordering on the predatory from Túrin if he were to take up Anglachel in this moment. So, as I said, the storm has all of these consequences, including convincing the orcs that Túrin is A, nowhere nearby, and B, there are no trails or tracks to follow in the first place, so they head off, and we can only imagine what happens when they return to Morgoth empty-handed, as we see here. Then Gwyndor performs this burial act, right? And we've talked about this before because we've never really had a clean sense on what is standard burial practices for elves. What is a standard burial rite? We're seeing the development here, it seems to me, of new kinds of practical burials here in the wake of the great and ongoing conflict against Morgoth. So we have a shallow grave here, and the placing beside him, of his earthly goods, right? Of Belthronding his great bow. Sadly, we do not have a accurate gloss of the word Belthronding. It isn't at all clear what it was that Tolkien intended that to mean. Although at this point in our reading of the Silmarillion, we might speculate that beside him Belthronding his great bow that was made of black yew wood. Oh, Belthronding probably means black yew bow, right? That's probably, we can be fairly 70% confident about that, I'm sure, but that word isn't glossed anywhere in Tolkien's notes, unfortunately. But the dread sword Anglachel Gwyndor took, saying that it were better that it should take vengeance on the servants of Morgoth than lie useless in the earth. This black, evil sword crafted by Eol the Dark Elf, well, okay, it's probably pretty good at cleaving orcs, right? He also took the Lembas of Melian to strengthen them in the wild, a practical choice there. For legal reasons, I cannot advise you to play a drinking game every time Túrin is stunned or struck dumb or left stricken or in some way incapacitated by the events that he witnesses, or just as often by the events that he causes. But if you are inclined to play such a drinking game, please do take care and stay hydrated, because we're going to be doing it a lot through this reading. Oh, I wanted to observe here that Lothlan, that name given to us in the first line of this slide, is the wide open plain. It's the great expanse in the northeast of Beleriand, just north of the marches of Mithros, right? You know where Mithros is protecting that little gap there in the northeast, the gap in the mountains, with the clear shot to Angband. That's Lothlan is the plain north and northeast of that. So let's get on to, I suppose, the actual end of Beleg Strongbow. Now that he has been buried, we can actually kind of commemorate him a little bit. Thus ended Beleg Strongbow, truest of friends, greatest in skill of all that harboured in the woods of Beleriand in the elder days, at the hand of him whom he most loved. And that grief was graven on the face of Túrin and never faded. But courage and strength were renewed in the elf of Nargothrond, and departing from Tower Nufuin, he led Túrin far away. Never once as they wandered together on long and grievous paths did Túrin speak, and he walked as one without wish or purpose, while the year waned and winter drew on over the northern lands. But Gwyndor was ever beside him to guard him and to guide him, and thus they passed westward over Sirion, and came at length to Ithil Ivrin, the springs whence Narog rose beneath the mountains of shadow. Then Gwyndor spoke to Túrin, saying, "Awake, Túrin, son of Húrin Thalion. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains unfailing and guarded from defilement by Ulmo, Lord of Waters, who brought her beauty in ancient days." Then Túrin knelt and drank from that water, and suddenly he cast himself down, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. There he made a song for Beleg, and he named it Lair Cu Beleg, the song of the great bow, singing it aloud, heedless of peril. And Gwyndor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, and Túrin knew that it was heavy and strong and had great power, but its blade was black and dull and its edges blunt. Then Gwyndor said, "This is a strange blade, and unlike any I have seen in Middle-earth. It mourns for Beleg, even as you do. But be comforted, for I return to Nargothrond of the house of Finarfin, and you shall come with me and be healed and renewed." Lair Cu Beleg is Sindarin for Song of the Great. bow. It's another one of these literal moments of translation here. The ku here is the same. Ku meaning bow is the same as the ku in Beleg Cuthalion, right? Beleg strongbow, Beleg Cuthalion. And in fact, the Thalion part also appears on this slide too. Awake Túrin, son of Húrin Thalion. Thalion meaning strong and hale, or as it's usually glossed in the context of Húrin, steadfast, right? Resolute. These are the qualities that we attribute to Húrin when we refer to him as Húrin Thalion. But the Thalion is the same Thalion as found in this Sindarin nickname for not even a Sindarin nickname, right? The Sindarin version of Beleg's nickname. Beleg strongbow, Beleg Cuthalion, Húrin Thalion. And as we see there, the ku from bow itself. So obviously, right, we've got a couple of open questions here. Let's take the latter first, because I find this really interesting. Gwyndor gave the sword Anglachel into his hands, and Túrin knew that it was heavy and strong and had great power, but its blade was black and dull and its edges blunt. Why is Anglachel blunt? Why is Anglachel... Yeah, I mean, I'm tempted to use these emotional words, right? Why is Anglachel grieving? Why has it lost some of its potency in this moment? It is sharp enough that as Beleg is freeing Túrin, and this may be, weeks, if not months earlier, of course, because it takes a long time to come down from the Tar Nufuin all the way to the head of the Nadog, right, which is where we are now. We've come all the way back down into Beleriand proper. So they have been wandering a good long while, and it is entirely possible that Gwyndor has not been caring for the sword of his fallen companion, but it is a magical sword. Are we supposed to imagine that it goes blunt through unuse over the course of weeks or a scant few months? That doesn't seem to be true of the blades of the elves of elder days, right? Particularly the skilled blacksmith. For all of his many faults, of course, no one contested that Eöl the Dark Elf wasn't an extremely skilled blacksmith. So why is it blunt? Well, as Gwyndor says, this is a strange blade, and unlike any I've seen in Middle-earth, it mourns for Beleg even as you do. And this open question of what Anglachel is and how we are to understand its personality is only going to become more intense and challenging as we move through the end of the reading, because spoilers if you haven't finished this week's chapter. This is a weird podcast to be listening to if you haven't, but if you haven't finished this week's chapter, at the end of Túrin's life, Anglachel is going to talk to him, or the sword that Anglachel becomes is going to talk to him and assure him that in fact it will happily take his life. And we're left in that moment to wonder, well, wait, is this literally true? Is this sword literally talking? Are we borrowing from an entirely different kind of fairy tale precursor that has not previously found its way into Tolkien's work? We don't, for all of the kind of semi-sentient, semi-sapient objects and artifacts that we find throughout the Legendarium. I'm thinking, of course, primarily of the ring, but we've also talked very recently about the Silmarils. There's certainly speculation about the other rings of power too. There are things which seem to have a personality to them, which have a soul poured into them, as Eöl may well have poured his soul into the creation of Anglachel and its sister blade, wielded now by his son Maiglin. Is it possible that this thing is just alive, or is it possible that we're seeing something else happen? And this is complicated still further, of course, by virtue of the fact that we're told that Eöl crafts Anglachel and its sister blade from a meteorite, right? This iron falls from the sky, and it can cleave any earth-made iron. And partly, I will say, coming back to my camera, just to talk very earnestly into my camera right now, partly this is true. Partly there is a real-life history of famous blades being crafted from meteorite iron. And the reason most often that meteorite iron is stronger is because of the additional nickel content of that iron. But there are historical examples of iron found in meteorites being crafted into swords which were actually just really great swords by the standards of the time. This is before we've got very, thorough and robust steel creation as an industry, right? We're not making yet swords of Damascus steel. We're still making, mostly kind of fairly heavy, fairly blunt pig iron, swords throughout most of medieval history. But there are, and pre-medieval history, because one of the most famous meteorite swords, of course, was found in the burial chamber of Tutankhamun, which I find extraordinary. But within the Legendarium, within our understanding of Tolkien's fantasy world, well, we already have kind of a notion of things that come from space, right? We talked about this back when we were talking about Ungoliant, when we were talking about these spirits that come from outside, and how, yes, textually, we might be able to understand that these are Maiar who have entered Arda at the moment of the great creation of Arda, shortly after that moment of Ea, right? They come into Arda, and that effectively Ungoliant is no different from Sauron, is no different from Melian, is no different from many of the other Maya who operate from Weenan and Osei, right? No different than the other Maiar in the world, but that does not change the fact that Ungoliant feels different. It doesn't change the fact that, as we discussed back at the time, Professor Tolkien has this kind of inclination toward the cosmic horror. He has this kind of stylistic inclination that's not a part of our factual understanding of his world as it's created, but is still, I think, present on the page, whether it's Ungoliant, whether it's the Watcher in the Water, whether it's the nameless things that claw unseen at the root of the world, right? He kind of keeps pulling out these evocative stories that can sit together as a kind of cosmic horror. And it's entirely possible to consider Anglachel as being a meteorite sword from space that has a special personality about it because it is a meteorite sword from space. To consider it in exactly the same way as we might consider some of these more excessive, more fringe, more outrageous kinds of aspects of cosmic horror about Tolkien's Legendary. And we're going to talk more about Anglachel as we go, but I'm happy for now to consider it a blade possessed of a certain personality, right? That it is, in fact, grieving for Beleg. It's so interesting, too, that it is mourning for Beleg, that it is mourning for its master, because you'll remember that Eol gave it up grudgingly to Thingol. The surrender of Anglachel to King Thingol is payment for Eol being left undisturbed in his forest, right? It is like a kind of rent payment that he gives to Thingol. And yet the sword itself believes Beleg to be its real wielder. And we might speculate about why that is, too, as we move forward. So that's one aspect of this that I find so completely fascinating. And the other, of course, is Eithel Ivrin, the springs whence Narog rose beneath the mountains of shadow. Then Gwyndor spoke to Túrin, saying, "Awake, Túrin, son of Húrin Thalion. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She is fed from crystal fountains unfailing, and guarded from defilement by Ulma, Lord of Waters, who wrought her beauty in ancient days." So first off, Gwyndor knows this place. We're going to find out later, in fact, that Gwyndor definitely knows this place. He knows this place so well that he has used it when crafting a nickname for his girlfriend, Findulis. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. But this is a sacred space to him. This is a space that he clearly understands and has clearly led Túrin here on purpose. He believes that it is a special place. So on the one hand, we get the presence of Ulmo, right? We get the now that we've kind of given like a process to this, I'm hesitant to casually use the word hallowing, right? Maybe this is not a hallowed space per se, but it is a space where Ulmo's influence is still strong. It is an undefiled space. It is a space still pure. It is a space still directly connected to the beauty of ancient days. And that's not all, because we also get this reference to endless laughter. On Ivrin's lake is endless laughter. She's fled from crystal fountains unfailing, right? Which, of course, is particularly and peculiarly significant to Túrin, whose sister, Lalaith, meaning laughter, died when he was 5 years old. So he's confronted by this image of the hopefulness of his family that was so cruelly taken away by the pestilence of Morgoth, which seems too close a connection to be accidental. It is, again, that combination, that contrast, that conflict, but also the intermingling of good fortune and bad. And maybe that's a way of understanding Túrin and understanding his place in the world, that he is maybe just a man with too much luck. Some of it good, some of it bad, some of it good, most of it bad, but just too much of it to carefully and successfully navigate the world. Yeah, as Galadriel Becky calls out, exactly. This is my next move, right? Interesting that the place of endless laughter enabled Túrin's healing tears. Absolutely, because what is the consequence of the death of his sister, Laughter? It is the naming of his other sister, Mourning. It is the naming of his other sister. We're calling forth Nienna here. We're calling forth the tears of grief that bring healing, which is clearly what happens to Túrin quite literally. Túrin knelt and drank from that water, and suddenly he cast himself down, and his tears were unloosed at last, and he was healed of his madness. This is Niana at work here. This is the grief that cleanses and brings wisdom. So you're right. And it's so fascinating that he is kind of, God, I want him to be bracketed by his sisters, and he's just not. It's just the case that he is not. Both of his sisters are younger sisters, right? One of whom he's never met, so it's hard to make that direct connection to Túrin himself, but the metaphorical connection, the framework that's laid out for us is absolutely there. His parents conceive first of Laughter, who dies, and then they conceive of mourning, which is also foreshadowing, of course, in this simple story. So Túrin is now healed, whatever that means. He composes his song, the Lyre Cúbelig. He sings it right there, heedless of peril. Gwyndor gives him his sword, and then takes him to Nargothrond. Nargothrond of the house of Finarfin, and you shall come with me and be healed and renewed. But first, before we do that, we should probably have some introductions, because these two men have never met. Who are you? Said Túrin. A wandering elf, a thrall escaped, whom Beleg met and comforted, said Gwyndor. Yet once I was Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, a lord of Nargothrond, until I went to the Nirnaeth Tharnodiad and was enslaved in Angband. Then have you seen Húrin, son of Galdor, the warrior of Dorloman? Said Túrin. I have not seen him, said Gwyndor, but rumour of him runs through Angband that he still defies Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin. That I do believe, said Túrin. And now they arose, and departing from Aethel Ivrin, they journeyed southward along the banks of the Nadog until they were taken by scouts of the elves and brought as prisoners to the hidden stronghold. Thus did Túrin come to Nargothrond. And that, for those of you keeping track at home, 53 minutes into tonight's session is where I planned on stopping last week's session. So we've still got a road ahead of us, don't we? I love this. Almost nothing in the story of Túrin Turambar is ground level in the way that we think of some of Tolkien's prose as being ground level, right? When we get to the Shire, we get ground level. When we're in Bree, we're at ground level, more or less. We're dealing with people with like recognizable psychology, with understandable emotional complexity, and we're kind of dealing with recognizable figures and archetypes from our own real world. That basically isn't true in the story of Túrin Turambar. It's basically not true in the whole Silmarillion. But this is one of the most naturalistic moments that I've ever read in Tolkien's work. That I do believe, said Túrin. Oh, yeah, my father is still defying Morgoth, and Morgoth has laid a curse upon him and all his kin. That tracks, actually. That makes a lot of sense to me and my experience of my own life. It seems as though, yeah, probably cursed by the most powerful entity in Beleriand. Yeah, I'd say so. That makes a lot of sense. So let's get to Nargothrond, and oh, good, it's about time. I've been really worried that we haven't introduced enough new names, so let's get to that. At first his own people did not know Gwyndor, who went out young and strong and returned now seeming as one of the aged among mortal men because of his torments and his labours. But Findulis, daughter of Orodreth the king, knew him and welcomed him, for she had loved him before the Nirnaeth, and so greatly did Gwyndor love her beauty that he named her Faelivrin, which is the gleam of the sun on the pools of Ivrin. For Gwyndor's sake, Túrin was admitted with him into Nargothrond, and he dwelt there in honour. But when Gwyndor would tell his name, Túrin checked him, saying, I am Agarwain, the son of Umarth, which is the blood-stained son of ill-fate, a hunter in the woods. And the elves of Nargothrond questioned him no more. In the time that followed, Túrin grew high in favour with Orodreth, and well nigh all hearts were turned to him in Nargothrond, for he was young, and only now reached his full manhood, and he was in truth the son of Morwen Elethwen to look upon, dark-haired and pale-skinned, with grey eyes, and his face more beautiful than any other mortal man in the elder days. His speech and bearing were that of the ancient kingdom of Doriath, and even among the elves he might be taken for one from the great houses of the Noldor. Therefore many called him Adanethal, the elf-man. The sword Anglachel was forged anew for him by cunning smiths of Nargothrond, and though ever black its edges shone with pale fire, and he named it Gurthang, Iron of Death. So great was his prowess and skill in warfare on the confines of the guarded plain that he himself became known as Mormegil, the Black Sword, and the elves said, the Mormegil cannot be slain save by mischance or an evil arrow from afar. Therefore they gave him dwarf mail to guard him, and in a grim mood he found also in the armories a dwarf mask all gilded, and he put it on before battle, and his enemies fled before his face. echoing there the dragon helm of Dordalomen, of course. So names, but before names, dates. This is the year 490 of the years of the sun. So Túrin here, upon his arrival in Nargothrond, is 26 years old. The passage of time in the time that followed, Túrin grew high in favor with Orodreth, and well nigh all hearts returned to him in Nargothrond. Basically, we're talking about the passage of 5 years here. In fact, that takes us to 495 of the years of the sun, when everything is going to go really, really bad. So this takes us through this period of peace in which Túrin Mormagil, the Black Sword, becomes a respected captain of Nargothrond. Túrin understands here, obviously, his own name to be relatively well known. It is entirely possible. There is still traffic between Nargothrond and Menegroth, Nargothrond and Doriath. So it's possible that if he comes in saying, oh, I am Túrin, son of Húrin, I am amazing, that people will recognize him, or that word will get back to Thingol. So he's protecting himself here by taking this different name. And we're going to increasingly see Túrin fleeing from himself under a series of different names. That what he is trying to do, in effect, is distance himself from his fate, distance himself from his doom, which of course is going to then make his adoption of the name Turambar, Master of Doom, all the more ironic. But here, Agorwain, the son of Umarth, which is the bloodstained son of ill fate, which of course, not inaccurate. Either part of that, in fact, works. He is profoundly bloodstained at this moment, right? The blood of Beleg Calathian still very much on his hands, and the son of ill fate. Yeah, I'd say that's pretty fair. But he's here deflecting attention away from his noble name here. We haven't mentioned Morwen Elethwen in a little while, of course. Túrin, son of Húrin, all the time, because we take this patronymic approach to families, to family names in particular, in the pages of the Legendarium. Morwen Elethwen is Túrin's mom, right? Elethwen there meaning elf sheen, or like elf fair. She is generally recognized as being one of the most beautiful women, the mortal women. You wind yourself up in complicated spaces sometimes when you're talking about Tolkien, and one of the spaces I keep finding myself in, because the race of human beings consistently being referred to as the race of man, and I can make the adaptation to talk about humans, but that is lacking a kind of mythic resonance that seems appropriate, right? Which is why I'm continuing to use the gendered term man while trying to strip it of its genderedness as we progress through these discussions. But then you wind up in weird places where you're talking about, well, Morwen and the other women of the man. It doesn't, you could talk about like the women of the elves, you could talk about, it doesn't quite work. But Morwen, Elethwen, elf sheen or elf fair, she's incredible to look at. And now here, canonically, Túrin, the hottest dude who ever lived. He's the hottest of all mortal men. Dark-haired and pale skin with gray eyes, his face more beautiful than any other among mortal men in the elder days. His speech and bearing were that of the ancient kingdom of Doriath, and even among the elves he might be taken for one from the great houses of the Noldor. And you'll remember that the reason that the elves like Húrin's family, they like this particular branch of the Edain when they come into Beleriand, is that they are most like the Noldor. They are similar looking. They are pale-skinned and generally dark-haired, like the Noldor are. They are smart and quick with craft, like the Noldor are. That's why they are favorite of the Noldor in the first place. And Túrin is like, mortal man plus. He's almost there. So he is called Adanethel, the elf man. Just another name to add to the pile. Agorwain, the son of Umarth, and also Adanethel, the Elfman, and Mormagil, the Black Sword. Three new names in the span of one single passage. Let's take a moment to talk about Findulis, because she's going to be so important as we move on. Yeah, Galadriel is calling out here in the chat, it sounds like he looks like Luthien. Yes, the same kind of combination, right? The dark hair and the pale skin. This is like... It's difficult to track exactly what the beauty standards are in Beleriand at this time. And certainly we have some fair-haired men, right? We have the Norse-inflected family of the Edain. We have the House of the Edain that are all blonde and quick to laughter. That's the other thing I meant to mention, actually, about Túrin, about the House of Húrin. And in fact, the other thing that the Noldor like is that they are not quick to laugh, that they are serious-minded, that they are almost melancholy, right? That's another thing that the Noldor apparently find very attractive. So you can tell a lot about the Noldor by the humans that they like best. But yeah, certainly there's a very similar beauty standard at play here, right? So I wanted to talk a little about Findulis, because obviously Findulis is going to be a very minor character in some regards, and yet also a very important character. There should be a, lay of Findulis that tells us her story from her perspective, because it's real tough. She is Orodreth's daughter, which means in this version of the story that she is the niece of Finrod Felagund. In other versions of the story presented in the Children of Húrin, when we have shuffled Orodreth down the family tree just a little bit, Findulis turns out to be Finrod Felagund's granddaughter, right? There's a whole extra generation added. Orodreth, as I mentioned before, is in some of Tolkien's later writings repositioned as Finrod's son rather than brother, but here in the pages of the Silmarillion, still brother. So Findulis is Finrod's niece, and therefore is the granddaughter of Finarfin and the great-granddaughter of Finwë. We don't, weirdly, get a direct translation of Findulis. We don't really understand what, again, this name is just not glossed for us in Tolkien's writing, and we don't really have enough to speculate the meaning of this name. It's possible that that first syllable, Fin, means hair. We see that show up in other places too, but in her family, in her extended family, that same syllable, I'm thinking of Finarfin and Fingolfin and Finrod and Fingon and Cura Finwë, right? That Fin doesn't seem to mean hair. It seems instead to mean, or to reference Finwë himself, right? The patriarch of this house. So it's unclear, but we will note that Gwyndor also calls her Faelivrin, referencing that lake of Ivrin, the pools of Ivrin, where he woke Túrin from his stupor. This is one of the ways that we know exactly how significant that place is to Gwyndor. Similarly, we don't know how old Findulis is. Tolkien wanted her to be young. That's clear in all of his writing. He wanted to situate her in the kind of vanguard of elven modernity here in Beleriand, and that's somewhat challenging, right? At one point, he wants to make her literally the youngest of the Noldorian exiles from Aman, which would make her, 500 or 600, maybe 600 years if she's 100 years when they come into Beleriand in the first place. But then later, he actually wanted her to be born in Beleriand, which would put her date of birth about 200 years before the present. So very, very young is Findulis. And the other name here, of course, that we should call out is the transformation from Anglachel to Gurthang. Anglachel, iron of the flaming star, iron of the fire star, right? The idea that it is a sword forged from a meteorite. And then the transition here, as it is reforged, meaning primarily just sharpened and kind of refitted here for Túrin, but also given this new name so that he can more completely take possession of it, though we will see at the end of tonight's reading, increasingly not tonight's reading, but maybe next week's reading, we will see that transformation is not complete, that the name change, as so many of these name changes in the story of Túrin Turambar, this name change does not take. It does not transform Anglachel into a new blade called Gurthang. This is still very much Anglachel all the way through the rest of this reading. And of course, we'll circle back to the dwarf mail and the dwarf mask protecting him here. Did I say that Gurthang means iron of death? Did I say that it was just a very literal name that it's given to us there on the page in front of us, in fact, yes. He named it Gurthang, iron of death. No more flaming stars, just purposeful murder. Let's get on to a little more of Findulis. Then the heart of Findulis was turned from Gwyndor, and against her will her love was given to Túrin. But Túrin did not perceive what had befallen, and being torn in heart, Findulis became sorrowful, and she grew wan and silent. But Gwyndor sat in dark thought, and on a time he spoke to Findulis, saying, "Daughter of the house of Finarfin, let no grief lie between us, for though Morgoth had laid my life in ruin, you still I love. Go whither love leads you, yet beware. It is not fitting that the elder children of Iluvatar should wed with the younger, nor is it wise, for they are brief and soon pass, to leave us in widowhood while the world lasts. Neither will fate suffer it unless it be once or twice only for some high cause of doom that we do not perceive. But this man is not barren. A doom indeed lies on him, as seeing eyes may well read in him, but a dark doom. Enter not into it, and if you will, your love shall betray you to bitterness and death. For hearken to me, though he may be indeed Agorwain, son of Umarth, his right name is Túrin, son of Húrin, whom Morgoth holds in Angband and whose kin he has cursed. Doubt not the power of Morgoth Bauglir. Is it not written in me?" Then Finduilas sat long in thought, but at last she said only, Túrin, son of Húrin, loves me not, nor will. Now when Túrin learnt from Finduilas of what had passed, he was wrathful, and he said to Gwyndor, In love I hold you for rescue and safekeeping. But now you have done ill to me, friend, to betray my right name and call my doom upon me, from which I would lie hid. But Gwyndor answered, The doom lies in yourself, not in your name. Gwyndor rapidly, as you're reading this chapter, as I am reading this chapter, I won't presume to speak for all of us, but for my experience of reading this chapter, Gwyndor rapidly ascending the ranked ladder of my favorite characters in the Silmarillion. I think this passage is fantastic. I think it bespeaks such wisdom and gentleness of spirit. I think there is a real goodness to Gwyndor through this. Gwyndor, who previously, yes, is the rash guy from Nargothrond who wants to go fight even though he shouldn't, and then blows the whole deal wide open on seeing his brother being dismembered in front of him, and sparks this premature charge against the forces of Morgoth that, yes, carry them all the way to the gates of Angband, but also severely blow their strategic opportunity to take Angband once and for all. So Gwyndor kind of has this really dubious first impression. He makes this really dubious first impression, but here I think restores something beautiful in terms of our understanding of Túrin at this point, and also his huge respect for Finduilas. I love, one of my favorite things on this entire slide is toward the end here. For hearken to me, though he be indeed Agorwine, son of Umarth, though he is in fact the name that he has given you, though he is these things, you'll notice how we've dropped out the capital letters there, because he's not naming Túrin, he's just describing Túrin at this point, which is a detail that I find works so well on the page, and I wonder how well it works verbally, right? I wonder how you communicate that when you are talking to someone in person. Though he is indeed Agorwine, son of Umarth, his right name is Túrin, son of Húrin. Wait, you just said his name and then you said his other. Okay. Oh, I get it. I see. You're describing him the first time. Gotcha. Okay. Túrin, son of Húrin, whom Morgoth holds in Angband and whose kin he is cursed. Doubt not the power of Morgoth Bauglir. Is it not written in me, right? He has now taken on the appearance of an old man, a thing that the elves do not themselves do. Now he looks like an aged mortal man for the trauma and the pain that he has been through at the hands of Morgoth. He looks completely different. He has been, in effect, as we'll learn very soon, in fact, he's been kind of physically ruined by his experiences with Morgoth. And he sees what is happening here, right? He wants to release Finduilas, daughter of the house of Finarfin. Let no grief lie between us, for the Morgoth has laid my life in ruin. For yeah, I know. Look, we have mirrors here in Nargothrond. I know what I look like. I know what I've been through. You wouldn't believe how this hip hurts when I try and stand up in the morning. You still I love, so go whither love leads you. He seems to be genuinely wanting what is best for her. And it seems to my reading, and perhaps this isn't a completely comprehensive reading. Perhaps you could read this differently and intuit or discern a different kind of purpose to his words here. I read this as being very genuine. Go whither love leads you, yet beware it is not fitting that the elder children of Iluvatar should wed with the younger, nor it is wise. Well, this is not racism here, right? This is not a prejudice against the younger children of Iluvatar that he's articulating here, because he gives the real reason. For they are brief and soon past to leave us in widowhood while the world lasts. Remember that elves do not take successive partners. They do not marry again. When your partner departs for the halls of Mandos, you just hang around and wait for them. That's what makes Finwë so unusual. That's what makes the whole situation so unusual back in Valinor, right? When Miriel Cinderé, the mother of Fëanor, goes off to the halls of Mandos and Finwë takes his second wife, that is an unusual thing. That's not going to happen here. You are going to love this kid. He's, oh God, in his mid-30s now. You've got maybe at best 40, 50 years with him, and then he's going to die and you're going to be a widow forever. Right? That's the tragedy of the bond between mortal men and immortal elves. Neither will fate suffer it unless it be once or twice only for some high cause of doom that we do not perceive. Yeah, sometimes there is a fate. Sometimes there is a cause We've all heard the story of Beren and Luthien. Sometimes there is a cause so great that the bridge, the gap between the children of Iluvatar can be bridged, the elder and the younger, in exactly the same way as Thingol married Melian, right? That shouldn't happen. That's probably not a common thing, right? Probably back in Valinor, there aren't a lot of Maiar and elves hooking up on the reg, but Thingol and Melian is an exception. There is a high doom there. But this man is not Beren. A doom indeed lies on him, as seeing eyes may well read in him. Yeah, okay, you only have to glance at Túrin to understand that a high doom lays upon him, but it is a dark doom. Enter not into it, and if you will, your love shall betray you to bitterness and death, for hearken to me. He is Túrin, son of Húrin. His family has been cursed by Morgoth, and Morgoth has unquestionable power. Is that not written here upon me in my body? To which Finduilas just replies, Túrin, son of Húrin, loves me not, nor will. And let's remember that Túrin is, in fact, completely ignorant of all of this, right there in the second line. Then the heart of Finduilas was turned from Gwyndor, and against her will her love was given to Túrin, but Túrin did not perceive what had befallen. Túrin is oblivious to all of this. We're not talking about a romance being kindled. We're talking about this love against her will, right? I'm kind of very tempted now to just start echoing Much Ado About Nothing, right? But against her will, she has fallen in love. And Túrin doesn't know about it. And Finduilas is saying, well, I guess it doesn't matter. It's not going to make a difference. It doesn't matter what his doom is. It doesn't matter what happened to Beren and Luthien or what will not happen between Finduilas and Túrin, because he doesn't love me and he's not going to. And maybe that's true. And maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it's what are the terms of the curse of Morgoth, right? Anyone that he loves, yes, but also anyone who was close to him, anyone who loves him too. We'll see what happens to Finduilas as we go forward. And then, of course, we have exactly Gwyndor echoing the point that I just made previously, that one of the reasons that Túrin is trying to hide his name is that he is trying to run from this doom, that he is trying to run from this fate. In love, I hold you for rescue and safekeeping. He's like, God damn it, Gwyndor, what did I say? For in love, I hold you for rescue and safekeeping, but now you have done ill to me, friend, to betray my right name and call my doom upon me from which I would lie hid. To which Gwyndor responds absolutely clearly, it's not your name that's going to get you in trouble. It's your you. It's your whole deal. You are already causing trouble here in Nargothrond. You are already drawing the attention of the foe. You are already changing how things should be here. Let's push on, because in fact, Gwyndor here, as in so many things, Gwyndor here is proved absolutely right. When it became known to Orodreth that the Mormagil was in truth the son of Húrin Thalion, he gave him great honor, and Túrin became mighty among the people of Nargothrond. But he had no liking for their manner of warfare, of ambush and stealth and secret arrow, and he yearned for brave strokes and battle in the open, and his counsels weighed with the king ever the longer the more. In those days the elves of Nargothrond forsook their secrecy and went openly to battle, and great store of weapons were made, and by the counsel of Túrin the Noldor built a mighty bridge over the Narog from the doors of Felagund for the swifter passage of their arms. Then the servants of Angband were driven out of all the land between Narog and Sirion, eastward and westward to the Nenning and the desolate Falas. And though Gwyndor spoke ever against Túrin in the council of the king, holding it an ill policy, he fell into dishonour, and none heeded him, for his strength was small, and he was no longer forward in arms. Thus Nargothrond was revealed to the wrath and hatred of Morgoth. And still in Túrin's prayer his true name was not spoken, and though the fame of his deeds came into Doriath and to the ears of Thingol, rumour spoke only of the black sword of Nargothrond. And that's it. Túrin proving Gwyndor's words true. The doom lies in yourself, Túrin, because you don't like covert warfare and guerrilla action, and instead you're becoming famous, which probably isn't the greatest strategy for someone who lives in the hidden super secret city of Nargothrond. So at the same time, of course, right, we're getting this dual edge of luck, of fate, of circumstance, of chance, if chance you call it. We're getting this give and take, this push and pull. Bad things are happening, but sometimes those bad things seem to be good things because they are actually clearing out Western Beleriand. They are actually reclaiming Western Beleriand from the forces of Morgoth, and that would be taken to be a good thing, right? The Mormagil, the black sword of Nargothrond, carving his way across the countryside with an open army of Noldor at his back. That seems like a good thing, except that in so doing, particularly and specifically in the construction of the bridge, as we'll see, the construction of the bridge is a pivot point for the future of Nargothrond, because it is a betrayal of the fundamental principle of Nargothrond, which is stay hidden, stay secret, stay safe. It is a defensible position that is rendered indefensible by the addition of this giant-ass bridge. Now, the bridge allows Túrin to lead his army forth, right? As he's gaining all of this political power, as he's gaining all of this fame and popularity, as he's becoming essentially the de facto leader of Nargothrond. This is not going to be the only time. This already, in fact, isn't the only time that this has happened. You'll remember that when he falls in with the outlaw band, he basically immediately takes over the outlaw band. Túrin is this guy. He's got something about him. When he is in a group of people like this, he just tends to take charge. And that's powerful, because he is a powerful personality, because he is a powerful figure, because he is a skilled warrior, and it's dangerous because he doesn't understand why things are sometimes the way that they are. He doesn't understand why Nargothrond needs to be sheltered and needs to be protected. And even that we can open up to scrutiny, because we, I think, as readers, are not completely sure that Nargothrond should be secret, are not completely sure that Nargothrond should be shrouded, that being hidden and remaining hidden is at best a stalling mechanism, that it is only buying them time. It is not in any way securing the victory against Morgoth. We talked a little about that last week. So yes, Túrin's name is revealed within Nargothrond, though luckily not outside of Nargothrond just yet, and his fame leads to this pivot in the strategy of Nargothrond in terms of fighting back against the orcs of Morgoth, all because the son of Húrin Thalion, Húrin the Steadfast, Húrin who endures, all because his boy wants fame, wants glory, wants the battle. Let's move on to an actual, direct message, voicemails here from the Valar. An excellent alternate title for this week's session. In that time of respite and hope, when because of the deeds of the Mormogil the power of Morgoth was stamped west of Sirion, Morwen fled at last from Dor Loman with Nienor her daughter, and adventured the long journey to Thingol's halls. There new grief awaited her, for she found Túrin gone, and to Doriath there had come no tidings since the dragon helm had vanished from the lands west of Sirion. But Morwen remained in Doriath with Nienor as guests of Thingol and Melian, and were treated with honour. Now it came to pass, when 495 years had passed since the rising of the moon and the spring of the year, there came to Nargothrond 2 elves, named Gelmir and Arminas, and they were of Angrod's people. And since the Dagor Bragalach they dwelt in the south with Círdan the shipwright. From their far journeys they brought tidings of a great mustering of orcs and evil creatures under the eaves of Eredwethrin and in the pass of Sirion, and they told also that Ulmo had come to Círdan, giving warning that great peril drew nigh to Nargothrond. Hear the words of the Lord of Waters, they said to the king. Thus he spoke to Círdan the shipwright. The evil of the north has defiled the springs of Sirion, and my power withdraws from the fingers of the flowing waters, but a worse thing is yet to come forth. Say therefore to the Lord of Nargothrond, shut the doors of the fortress and go not abroad. Cast the stones of your pride into the loud river, that the creeping evil may not find the gate. I love the incidental detail here that these elves, Gelmir and Arminas, are coming from the Falas, right? They're coming from the realm of Círdan the shipwright, all the way down there in the southwest, to tell the people of Nargothrond about things that are happening in the north of Beleriand, because Ulmo still has that awareness of what happens close to all the waters of Middle-earth, right? We were told about that way back in the Valaquenta, right? That whatever unfolds on Earth, Ulmo knows about it because the water is everywhere, but that now, for the first time, is not completely true. The evil of the north has defiled the springs of Sirion, and my power withdraws from the fingers of the flowing waters. We already know that the orcs are gathering, the evil creatures under the eaves of Eredwethrin and the pass of Sirion, right? Up there by Tol Sirion, the original Minas Tirith that became the Isle of Werewolves, right? That pass through the mountains there, where so many battles have already been fought. A new great mustering is taking place there. And furthermore, Ulmo's power in that realm is being forcibly withdrawn because Morgoth is poisoning, defiling the springs of Sirion. So Ulmo, who of course counseled Finrod Felagund in the first place, as he counseled Turgon to build Gondolin, he counseled Finrod Felagund to build Nargothrond in the first place. Find a place to hide was the message from Ulmo. And now he sends another message. Shut the doors of the fortress and go not abroad. Cast the stones of your pride into the loud river, that the creeping evil may not find the gate. You've got to shut this down. You have got to hide. because hiding is the only way to endure the force that is coming against you. What's interesting here too, before we move on, we should acknowledge, right? Again, another twist of fate here, another conflict, a contrast of good luck and bad luck, if that's a correct way of interpreting either side of this thing. Túrin is riding out. He's taking the elves with him. They're cleansing the whole realm of orcs, which means for the first time since the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, that Morwen can travel forth from Dor Loman. She can make the desperate run to Doriath as Túrin did when he was a tiny little boy, right? So she does. They venture forth. Morwen fled at last from Dor Loman with Nienor, her daughter, and adventured the long journey to Thingol's halls, fully expecting when she gets to Doriath to find Túrin in the household of King Thingol, and then being appalled, in fact, that not only is he not there, but no word has come since the Dragonhelm vanished from the lands west of Sirion when Túrin was captured. This is more than 5 years ago at this point. But Morwen remains in Doriath with Nienor as guests of Thingol and Melian and are treated with honor. So if not for Túrin's intervention at this point, if not for his transformation of the military strategy of Nargothrond, this would not happen. And as Túrin himself is going to observe later, hey, it's probably great, actually, that my mom and sister are now in Doriath, because Doriath is the safest place to be. So maybe everything I did was right, and maybe I'm the world's smartest boy? We'll see how that works out for sure. We get the ominously specific date, and we are absolutely in that phase of the Silmarillion that anytime we get an ominously specific date, it is for a powerful reason. It is now 495 of the years of the sun. Túrin is 31 years old. His little sister Nienor is 21. Just to kind of have that in your brain. She's a full 10 years younger as we move forward. And meet for the... Oh, that's interesting. What, the third time? Meet Glaurung, now in his full power, now very close to the ground. Orodreth was troubled by the dark words of the messengers, but Túrin would by no means hearken to these counsels, and least of all would he suffer the great bridge to be cast down, for he was become proud and stern, and would order all things as he wished. Soon afterwards, Handir, lord of Brethil, was slain, for the orcs invaded his land, and Handir gave them battle, but the men of Brethil were worsted and driven back into their woods. And in the autumn of the year, biding his hour, Morgoth loosed upon the people of Narog the great host he had long prepared. And Glaurung, the Uraloki, passed over Anfauglith, and came thence into the north vales of Sirion, and there did great evil. Under the shadows of Ered Wethrin he defiled the Aethel Ivrin, and thence he passed into the realm of Nargothrond, and burned the Talath Dirnan, the guarded plain between Narog and Teiglin. Then the warriors of Nargothrond went forth, and tall and terrible on that day looked Túrin, and the heart of the host was upheld, and he rode on the right hand of Orodreth. But greater far was the host of Morgoth than any scouts had told, and none but Túrin, defended by his dwarf mask, could withstand the approach of Glaurung. And the elves were driven back and pressed by the orcs into the field of Tumhalad between Ginglith and Narog, and there they were penned. On that day all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away, and Orodreth was slain in the forefront of the battle, and Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, was wounded to the death. But Túrin came to his aid, and all fled before him, and he bore Gwyndor out of the rout, and escaping into a wood there laid him on the grass. Because when Túrin's reckless pride is revealed to be a reckless pride, it is revealed all at once. It is revealed super quick with the coming of the orc host of Morgoth, and more specifically the coming of Glaurung, the Uraloki, right? The fire drake. We had that before. Glaurung, the first dragon, passing over Anfauglith, coming thence into the north vales of Sirion, and they are doing great evil, including defiling Aethel Ivrin, including the ruination of those pools which so specifically healed Túrin earlier in the reading. So the men of Nargothrond go forth, right? They ride the way that Túrin has taught them to ride. They fight and battle the way that Túrin has taught them to fight and battle. Tall and terrible on that day looked Túrin, and the heart of the host was upheld, and he rode on the right hand of Orodreth, right? The kind of the formality of him being the king's right-hand man going into battle here, though he is now absolutely calling the shots, right? As we see in that first para here. Orodreth is troubled by the dark words of the messengers, but Túrin would by no means hearken to these counsels, and least of all would he suffer the great bridge to be cast down, for he was become proud and stern and would order all things as he wished. The bridge, of course, being the symbol of Túrin's transformation of Nargothrond's military strategy. Of course, military and politics, very different things and not at all to be confused. And this is it. This is a series wrap for Ordreth here, who unfortunately, I think, in retrospect, has not made the greatest impression, right? It is, well, you know what? I think it's maybe fairer to say that the people of Nargothrond have not made the greatest impression here, because they are, is the best word fickle? They are easily led. They are easily swayed, right? They're absolutely united. They are present behind Finrod Felagund, until he decides to leave on his quest with Baron. And then we have all the politicking of Calanthir and Cudafin. And they're swayed away from Ordreth even in that moment. And then Ordreth gets it back just in time for Túrin to show up and instead take over again. I feel as though Ordreth was perhaps not the strongest king that they ever had. So Túrin leads the forces out and they are immediately crushed. That's it, right? They're driven back. Morgoth's army is again far larger than their scouts have reported. Feels like they should get better scouts at this point. Feels as though you should not trust the reports of your scouts if you are facing off against Morgoth's armies. And they're driven back, pressed by the orcs into the field of Tumhalad between Ginglith and Narog. There they are penned. On that day, all the pride and host of Nargothrond withered away. Ordreth slain at the forefront of the battle. Gwyndor, son of Gwilyn, in the battle, though we are told he is of little strength at this point, right? This is why no one is listening to him back home. Even though he is counseling constantly against Túrin and counseling for greater wisdom, greater caution, greater care, because he is physically weak and worn by the awfulness of his capture and torment by Morgoth, he's not listened to, but in the crisis moment, he still takes up arms and rides out with Túrin. And when this happens, he's wounded to the death, but Túrin comes to his aid and all fled before him, and he bore Gwyndor out of the rout, escaping into a wood that there laid him on the grass, not rescuing Ordreth, rescuing Gwyndor. Túrin's pride, well, it's such a fascinating thing. We're going to have better opportunities to talk about it as we move forward. Glaurung, too, I should note, this, I think, is the third appearance of Glaurung. We had the first appearance when he was not yet full grown, and he fled back into Angband. Then we had a second appearance during the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, where he was beset by the dwarves of Belagos, right? And we're seeing here again that it is the dwarf mask that Túrin is wearing that enables him to even face Glaurung, right? Without that dwarf mask, there's some, well, we'll see it more clearly again as we move forward. Let's see what's next as we get to the death of Gwyndor and the sack of Nargothrond. Then Gwyndor said to Túrin, "Let bearing pay for bearing. But ill-fated was mine, and vain is thine. For my body is marred beyond healing, and I must leave Middle-earth. And though I love thee, son of Hurin, yet I rue the day that I took thee from the orcs. But for thy prowess and thy pride, still I should have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. Now if thou love me, leave me. Haste thee to Nargothrond and save Findulas. And this last I say to thee, she alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell." Then Túrin sped back to Nargothrond, mustering such of the rout as he met with on his way, and the leaves fell from the trees in a great wind as they went, for the autumn was passing to a dire winter. But the host of the orcs and Glaurung the dragon were there before him, and they came suddenly ere those that were left on guard were aware of what had befallen on the field of Tumhalad. In that day the bridge over Narog proved an evil, for it was great and mightily made, and could not swiftly be destroyed. And the enemy came readily over the deep river, and Glaurung came in full fire against the doors of Felagund, and overthrew them, and passed within. And even as Túrin came up, the dreadful sack of Nargothrond was well nigh achieved. The orcs had slain or driven off all that remained in arms, and were even then ransacking the great halls and chambers, plundering and destroying, and those of the women and maidens that were not burned or slain they had herded on the terraces before the doors as slaves to be taken to Morgoth's thraldom. Upon this ruin and woe Túrin came, and none could withstand him, or would not, though he struck down all before him and passed over the bridge and hewed his way towards the captives. Gwyndor's maybe finest moment? Maybe? Professing his love for this foolish, prideful man? Let bearing pay for bearing, right? As Gwyndor pulled Túrin to safety effectively after the death of Beleg, thus now Túrin has carried Gwyndor to safely. But ill-fated was mine, says Gwyndor, and vain is thine, for my body is marred beyond healing, and I must leave Middle-earth. And though I love thee, son of Hurin, yet I rue the day I took thee from the orcs. But for thy prowess and thy pride, still I would have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. You have ruined this. It is Not, I think, Túrin's fault. I think there's so much that we can lay at the feet of Túrin Turambar, son of Húrin. But the love of Findulis is probably not one of them, right? That is a thing that occurred within her, but still, nonetheless. But for thy prowess and thy pride. Even here, Gwyndor is kind of crediting Túrin's, martial awesomeness for winning the heart of fair Findulis. But for thy prowess and thy pride, still I should have love and life, and Nargothrond should yet stand a while. You have done this. This is your fault. And if we're unclear on that, right, coming into this story, if we are uncertain whether or not Gwyndor is right, we get absolute proof of that when we get to the damn bridge. In that day, the bridge over Narog proved an evil, for it was great and mightily made and could not swiftly be destroyed. They can't even take it down now that it has been constructed before Glaurung immediately crosses it, of course, gains access to the doors of Felagund, overthrows them, and passes within Glaurung the dragon, within the caves of Nargothrond, is a horrifying thought. But Gwyndor here goes beyond honesty to a kind of foresightedness again, right? I think that we can read this in the cadence of someone who is close to death and thus has some of that wisdom. We're seeing some of that prophetic foresight again, right? Haste thee, now if thou love me, leave me. Haste thee to Nargothrond and save Findulis. This last I say to thee, she alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell. Now we might read that as the love of a man for a woman, that Gwyndor is still in love with Findulis and wants her saved. He wants her preserved from the ruin of Nargothrond that Túrin has brought upon them, right? That Túrin has destroyed this safe place, but Findulis can still be saved, right? We might just choose to believe that Gwyndor wants that to be true. He would go and save the woman I love. You son of a bitch. You have ruined all of this. Go and save the woman I love. At least do one good thing as I die here, right? But I think that there's something more happening here. I am inclined to read this, given the number of moments of foresight and prophecy that we've had in this story in particular. I'm inclined to read this as a prophetic wisdom. She alone stands between thee and thy doom. If thou fail her, it shall not fail to find thee. Farewell. Is there a chance that Túrin can exhibit a wisdom, a selflessness, what would that be? A loyalty, I suppose? A self-sacrificing loyalty to others that will avert his doom? Is the mechanism by which Morgoth's curse is operating simply pride? Is that the means by which Túrin is being driven here so relentlessly into the dust? Well, we'll see as we get to the final, and spoilers, tragic, awful fate of Findulis as we move forward. So Nargothrond has fallen. And as I said when we started tonight's reading, it's kind of weird that it happens so incidentally, right? Because we've had this now, certainly since the beginning of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, and even before then to a certain degree, right? We've got the safe places of Beleriand, Nargothrond and Gondolin and Doriath, and that's kind of it, right? Those are certainly the elves up in Hithlum. We've got the Sons of Feanor up on the northeast side there. We've got Mithros' of lot guarding the marches of Mithros there. We've even got to a certain degree the Green Elves down in Assyrian, right? We've got the elves of the Falas down in the southwest. We have some places of strength. We have some places of fortitude here in Beleriand, but the three places that have stood against the might of Morgoth, the three places that have been the hope of the continuation of elven identity are the two Noldor strongholds of Gondolin and Nargothrond, and Menegroth of the Sindar, of course. And now one is gone. And it doesn't get the same kind of dramatic punch that we might expect, because this is a different type of story, because we're in a different tenor here, right? Because we're so close to Túrin, because very directly and very candidly, the destruction of Nargothrond is incidental at this point. It's politically important, it's historically important, it's mythically important, but it is not practically important except as a turning point in the story of Túrin Turambar, which is why I think it's dispensed with so swiftly. And this is really, I think, where I've expressed this discomfort about the tone of this particular story, not a discomfort about it in terms of I don't like it or I don't care for it. As I said last week, it is my least favorite, but that means it's my least favorite thing out of a bunch of things that I really, really, really love. But there is an odd assonance, a dissonance here between these different types of story. But we have to commend Professor Tolkien for not, in the middle of this story, pulling all the way back up and giving us the 10,000-foot view of what the destruction of Nargothrond means. It would be very tempting to do so. It would be very tempting to slip back into the tone of Beleriand and its realms, right? To give us the kind of very dry elven history gloss of, and thus when Nargothrond fell. We're going to do... Well, I was going to say we're going to do a little bit of that. We are going to do a little bit of that, but it's a very little bit. It is nothing like as much as you would expect. And we don't do it right here because we're so deeply enmeshed in the story of Túrin himself. Galadriel is saying that's definitely foreshadowing. I am inclined to agree, Galadriel. I think you're completely right here. Yeah. So let's get to let's get to our showdown, shall we? Right? Like, what are we wasting time for? Let's get to it. The showdown between Túrin and Glaurung. And now he stood alone, for the few that followed him had fled. But in that moment Glaurung issued from the gaping doors and lay behind between Túrin and the bridge. Then suddenly he spoke by the evil spirit that was in him, saying, "Hail, son of Húrin, well met." Then Túrin sprang about and strode against him, and the edges of Gurthung shone as with flame. But Glaurung withheld his blast and opened wide his serpent eyes and gazed upon Túrin. Without fear Túrin looked into them as he raised up the sword, and straightway he fell under the binding spell, of the lidless eyes of the dragon, and was halted, moveless. Then for a long time he stood as one graven of stone, and they two were alone, silent before the doors of Nargothrond. But Glaurung spoke again, taunting Túrin, and he said, "Evil have been all thy ways, son of Húrin, thankless, fosterling, outlaw, slayer of thy friend, thief of love, usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy, and deserter of thy kin. As thralls, thy mother and thy sister live in Dorloman in misery and want. Thou art arrayed as a prince, but they go in rags, and for thee they yearn. But thou carest not for that. Glad may thy father be to learn that he hath such a son, as learn he shall." And Túrin, being under the spell of Glaurung, hearkened to his words, and he saw himself as a mirror misshapen by malice, and loathed that which he saw. And while he was yet held by the eyes of the dragon in torment of mind and could not stir, the orcs drove away the herded captives, and they passed nigh to Túrin and crossed over the bridge. Among them was Findulis, and she cried out to Túrin as she went. But not until her cries and the wailing of the captives was lost upon the northward road did Glaurung release Túrin, and he might not stop his ears against that voice that haunted him after. That is, of all the malice of Morgoth, of all the cruelty of Glaurung, that is a moment that really hits me deep, that even as he is being held in the thrall of the dragon, even as he is being held by the force of Glaurung's will here upon the bridge of Nargothrond that he himself constructed, as the captives are being led away, Findulis is crying out to Túrin because she can see him right there, and he is not helping her. And he can hear it. That voice haunts him after, right? Just resonates in his head. It's so interesting to think of the draconic tradition of which Glaurung is a part here, because this is not, to be clear, this is not really the Glaurung that we've seen previously, right? This isn't really the Glaurung that we saw up on Anfalglith either time, in fact, right? Not that first time where he was fairly readily defeated, or the second time where he was much more challengingly defeated, or at least forestalled by the dwarves. This is a Glaurung who is much more in the mode of Smaug. This is if you've just come reading The Hobbit to the pages of the Silmarillion, which would be a wild reading strategy, by the way, to completely skip The Lord of the Rings and jump from The Hobbit to the Silmarillion. I wonder if anyone's ever done that. I would be fascinated to talk to that person. That would be that is the greatest whiplash, right? In all of Tolkien's Legendarium, is to go from the cozy pages of The Hobbit into, the Ainulindalë, laying out the whole deep history of the elves of Middle-earth. I love the thought of that. But if you have come from The Hobbit, the one thing that you will recognize very readily, I think, is, oh, dragon. This is what dragons are like. This is Glaurung here. And Smaug, fascinatingly, sits very oddly. There's a reason why Smaug doesn't show up in the pages of The Lord of the Rings, and that's because he doesn't quite fit that much more... much more mechanistic, much more militaristic, much more logistical, kind of real-life armies on the move kind of model. Smaug would be narratively challenging for the pages of The Lord of the Rings, right? A similar kind of creature, of course, is Shelob, but Shelob is very contained geographically. Shelob does not issue forth against the armies of the West. That would be a real difficult thing to commit to on the page, I think. We're trying to keep those battles in a much more realistic register, which of course we also do at the very end of The Hobbit, right? As we move to the Battle of Five Armies, we're kind of making that transition. It has been noted many times, not least of all by me, of course, that is the moment when The Hobbit stops being The Hobbit and starts kind of leaning toward The Lord of the Rings, is with the death of Smaug and the coming of the Five Armies. But this Glaurung feels very much like a dragon of that mold. And when I say that mold, what I mean is medieval fairy tales. What I mean is medieval fantasy. What I mean is that peculiarly Northern European, Scandinavian, Old German kind of mythological narrative form. I think that this is the wise and witty and cruel and manipulative dragon, who is enormously capable, of course, enormously physically powerful and physically dangerous, but is all the more dangerous because of the power of his will, the power of his words, which is not unlike the power of Sauron, which is not unlike the power of Morgoth himself, right? It's kind of about the stories that you tell. It's the way you use language. It's the way that you exert your will upon others and bend them, break them sometimes to your own will. And in fact, I think that is in part like a companionable point. The reason, or one of the reasons that we don't have Smaug in The Lord of the Rings, is that we have Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, and you don't really need those two. They would overlap a little in terms of their domain and practice, I think, just a little bit. So as an unusual part of the Legendarium, I think that Glaurung works brilliantly here as a monster perhaps better suited to the pages of Beowulf than the pages of The Lord of the Rings. I think that Glaurung is fantastic. The courtesy here. And perhaps more importantly, right, if we're keeping track of the story itself, look how astute Glaurung is here. Look how much of Túrin's story is known. Evil have been all thy ways, son of Húrin, thankless fosterling, outlaw, slayer of thy friend, thief of love, usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy and deserter of thy kin. Like, holy smokes, man, that's literally everything. That's Túrin's whole thing. Thankless fosterling of Thingol back in Doriath, check. Outlaw, yeah, we talked about that. Slayer of thy friend, yeah, that's Balog, rest in peace, absolutely. Thief of love, technically, right? What's an inadvertent thief, right? He was standing there and Finduilas fell in love with him, but sure, okay, we'll take it. Usurper of Nargothrond, absolutely robbing the rightful rule of Nargothrond from its king, just as surely as Caranthir and Codafin would have done or tried to do, right? Captain Foolhardy, absolutely, riding out with your elves behind you, shedding all secrecy, all caution, all wisdom, all strategy, and deserter of thy kin right now in this moment. That's what's happening. Your kin are being led away. The elves and the men of Nargothrond, mostly elves, but there are some men there, being led away. As thralls, thy mother and thy sister live in Dor-Lómin. This is the other aspect of deserter of thy kin, of course. But as thralls, thy mother and thy sister live in Dor-Lómin in misery and want. They're up there under the boot of the Easterlings, right? The Easterlings are given Dor-Lómin to rule, you'll remember, in the wake of the Nirnaeth Arnodiad, and his mother and sister are still there. Thou art arrayed as a prince, but they go in rags, and for thee they yearn, and thou carest not for that. This is not true. Certainly not true at this point, right? But it is the best knife to twist into Túrin's side here. It is, well, the cruelty of Glaurung. And we see that very clearly here, right? And Túrin, being under the spell of Glaurung, hearkened to his words. So because he is under the influence of Glaurung, he is listening. He is not just listening, but he is hearing. He is believing the words of the dragon. And because he saw himself as in a mirror, misshapen by malice, and loathed that which he saw. And maybe it's easy for modern eyes to look at that and think, he could maybe do with a little bit of self-reflection, honestly. Like, not this twisted, awful, mirror made of dragon lies. That's probably a bad mirror to look into. But like a regular mirror, probably pretty helpful for Túrin at this point. We are running so late. It is 10:45 now. Let's do one more. Let's get him Yes. Oh, God, we're only halfway through. We're going to wind up doing a whole third week on the story of Túrin Turambar. It is just rich is the problem. It is just really compelling. And obviously at this point, I'm loath to skip over the details here. I think we're going to wind up doing a third week. The good news is that will be on Thursday. And the better news for me is that I've already done all my notes and slides for that. So it's going to be an easy week of prep for me. Let's do one more slide. We'll get to the departure of Túrin from Nargothrond, and then we'll pick up with his story and the last calamitous, tragic part of Túrin Turambar's story in next week's session. Then suddenly Glaurung withdrew his glance and waited, and Túrin stirred slowly as one waking from a hideous dream. Then coming to himself, he sprang upon the dragon with a cry, but Glaurung laughed, saying, "If thou wilt be slain, I will slay thee gladly. But small help will that be to Morwen and Nienor. No heed didst thou give to the cries of the elf woman. Wilt thou deny also the bond of thy blood?" But Túrin, drawing back his sword, stabbed at the dragon's eyes, and Glaurung, coiling back swiftly, towered above him and said, "Nay, at least thou art valiant, beyond all whom I have met, and they lie who say that we of our part do not honor the valor of foes. See now, I offer thee freedom. Go to thy kin if thou canst. Get thee gone, and if elf or man be left to make tale of these days, then surely in scorn they will name thee, if thou spurnest this gift." Then Túrin, being yet bemused by the eyes of the dragon, as were he treating with a foe that could know pity, believed the words of Glaurung, and turning away he sped over the bridge. But as he went, Glaurung spoke behind him, saying in a fell voice, "Haste thee now, son of Húrin, to Dorlomin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before thee once again. And if thou tarry for Findulis, thou never shalt thou see Morwen again, and never at all shalt thou see Nienor thy sister, and they will curse thee." We're going to see in... Oh, I guess we're going to do one more slide. Yeah, we're going to do one more slide after this one to wrap up this part of the story. I had forgotten that this was split over two. We're going to do one more slide, but we will see in the first slide of next week's reading the moment when the influence of the dragon is lifted from Túrin. And this is very important because of this ongoing discussion about Túrin's culpability, about what is Túrin's flaw and how is that flaw made manifest? What are the choices that he makes? What are the mistakes that he makes as he is carving his way through the world of Middle-earth? And one of those, obviously, that we've flagged already, is Gwyndor's advice to him, hey, save Findulis. You have to save Findulis, and that will forestall your doom. And if you don't, then you, my friend, are screwed. You are done if you don't save Findulis. We have to pay close attention here because it's easy to read this as Túrin, yes, being under the influence of the dragon, absolutely, but also choosing ultimately to go after his mom and sister, and he doesn't. He is still vitally, crucially under the influence of the dragon. Túrin, in this instance, has no choice. That's, I think, completely clear on the page, right? We have this great lie from Glaurung. At least thou art valiant beyond all whom I have met, and they lie who say that we of our part do not honor the valor of foes. See now, I offer thee freedom. Go to thy kin if thou canst. Get thee gone. Right? He's feigning this position of, no, respectable, warrior to warrior, great force of martial power in Beleriand, to great force of martial power in Beleriand. I respect you. I give you a nod. Now depart the battlefield and live your life. Go save your family, right? That is, again, an interesting bit of propaganda here. It's an interesting gambit. It's an interesting piece of persuasion and rhetoric, but we're told very clearly how this is playing out for Túrin. Then Túrin, being yet bemused by the eyes of the dragon, as were he treating with a foe that could know pity, believed the words of Glaurung. Oh, okay. He's still operating under the spell. He's believing that Glaurung can offer pity, can know pity, and by implication, Glaurung cannot and does not, and thus Túrin believes him. Turning away, he sped over the bridge, but as he went, he speaks behind him again. Haste thee now, son of Húrin, to Dorlomin, or perhaps the orcs shall come before thee once again. And if thou tarry for Findulis, then never shalt thou see Morwen again, and never at all shalt thou see Nienor thy sister, and they will curse thee. He doesn't at this moment have a choice, and we know this for sure because in that first slide of next week, we are going to see the moment when finally, the influence of the dragon lifts. It is reduced now. It is reduced to the point that Túrin can take action, but not reduced to the point that he is completely free of the influence. And this is not to to liberate Túrin from our judgment. This is not to pretend for a moment that the choices that Túrin makes are good or strong or selfless. None of this should have happened, right? All of this happens because Túrin is prideful. All of this happens because Túrin, by force of personality, it seems, can't help but fall into positions of authority and then let that go to his head. And spoilers, this isn't even the last time that it happens. The destruction of Nargothrond is not the last time that Túrin will find himself large and in charge. We're going to talk more about that next week. Let's wrap this up here with the final note on Glaurung for this passage. But Túrin passed away on the northward road, and Glaurung laughed once more, for he had accomplished the errand of his master. Then he turned to his own pleasure, and sent forth his blast and burned all about him. But all the orcs that were busy in the sack he routed forth and drove them away, and denied them their plunder even to the last thing of worth. The bridge then he broke down and cast into the foam of Narog, and being thus secure, he gathered all the hoard and riches of Felgund, and heaped them, and lay upon them in the innermost hall, and rested a while. And Túrin hastened along the ways of the north, through the lands now desolate between Narog and Teiglin, and the fell winter came down to meet him, for in that year snow fell ere autumn was past, and spring came late and cold. Ever it seemed to him that he went, as he went, that he heard the cries of Findulis, calling his name by wood and hill, and great was his anguish, but his heart being hot with the lies of Glaurung, and seeing ever in his mind the orcs burning the house of Hurin, or putting Morwen and Nienor to torment, he held on his way, and turned never aside. At last, worn by haste in the long road, for 40 leagues and more had he journeyed without rest, he came with the first ice of winter to the pools of Ivrin, where before he had been healed. But they were now but a frozen mire, and he could drink there no more. This is the defilement of the pools of Ivrin. They have been frozen. Well, this perhaps is not the single solitary defilement, but what we know of the pools of Ivrin is that they are constantly of laughter, right? They constantly tinkle with laughter because of the fountains there, the headwaters of the Syrian, and in order for them to be frozen, of course, either the winter must be so severe that even the fountains themselves, and we're not meaning literally fountains here, of course, but crashing waterfalls and streams from above, that they themselves have frozen, or that they themselves have been stopped somehow. It's unclear, but whatever it is, we get the poetic inversion here. We get the resonance here, that he has come once again to the pools of Ivrin, where he once again is laboring under this condition of bewilderment and stupefaction, right? He's now under the influence of the dragon, where before he was under the influence of his guilt and trauma for killing Beleg in cold blood. But this time he cannot be healed. This time the power of Ulmo is denied him. We have, of course, Glaurung doing what Glaurung does, what dragons do, and making the first attested dragon horde in history, right? This is the first, in all of Arda, there has never before been a dragon horde. There has never before been a big pile of gold coins upon which rests a dragon, but now we have it. A little different, of course, because Glaurung can't fly. So, Glaurung is a wingless dragon, so we can't quite do the direct Smaug, aesthetic comparison here, but it's similar nonetheless. What I'm most interested about here, of course, is Glaurung accomplishing the errand of his master. Glaurung laughed once more, for he had accomplished the errand of his master. Then he turned to his own pleasure. This is mission accomplished. This is mission successful right here. He did it. He sent Túrin, and I'm inferring here that this was his errand, that he has sent Túrin north to Dor Loman. Does this suggest that Morgoth knows, or at least has enough certainty to orchestrate this counter-strategy, that Findulis is in some way the solution to Túrin's doom, or the counter-agent to Túrin's doom? Because that is what is happening right here, is that Túrin has been charged up. He's he's got a full new set of AA batteries. He has been wound up and sent north, and that's it. He's tormented by the thought of Findulis. He's tormented by the sound of her voice still echoing in his head, still echoing in the hills and the woods. I'm taking this to be, of course, not literal. I don't think that she is still calling to him now weeks later as he journeys north. But her voice still echoing within him. He is conflicted but cannot turn aside from his path, the path that Glaurung directly set him upon. And in all of this is the quote that I was referencing earlier here. This is from earlier in the chapter, that weird tonal rhetorical transition that we noted last week. Who knows now the counsels of Morgoth, who can measure the reach of his thought, who had been Melkor mighty among the Ainur of the great song, and sat now a dark lord upon a dark throne in the north. How much actually does Morgoth know? We talk all the time about his spies going forth into the land of elves and man, right? But how much does he actually know? How much does he comprehend? And if he's given Hurin, who is imprisoned on the tallest peak of Thangorodrim, right? If he has given Hurin the ability to see and to hear all that transpires in Beleriand for the purposes of his torment, do we think that Morgoth doesn't also have that power? Do we think that Morgoth is cowering, shrouded in the deepest pit of Angband? Or does he understand more about the mechanics of Túrin's fate than might be immediately apparent? Is this fell luck? Is this Túrin's pride? Is this Túrin's tragic flaw as a traditionally tragic hero? Or is there something more directly active, conspiring against Túrin at every turn? Because this seems to me to be a very curiously specific errand on which Glaurung has been dispatched. And that, as we approach 2 hours and my voice gets perilously close to giving up entirely, that's going to be that. I guess we're going to finish up Túrin Turambar next week, you guys. I had a really nice slide prepared for the end of tonight's session. I don't know, 20 slides from now, where I was going to talk about doing the Ruin of Doriath next week and kind of trying to maybe even cover 2 chapters next week. And then we'd be into the Voyage of Eärendil. We'd be closing out the Quintus Silmarillion, then a week on the Akalabeath and a week on the Rings of Power in the Third Age. All of that will happen just another week down the line. That probably means that we're going to be starting Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility, the fantastic Sense and Sensibility, the second week of July, let's say. But it has been an absolute pleasure talking about Túrin. Well, okay, I've had a lot of fun this evening talking about Túrin Turambar. Never an unalloyed pleasure, but still a really interesting story to wrestle with and to understand. And if you haven't yet read the end of the story, which would make listening to this podcast a bold choice on your part, if you haven't yet read the end of the story, there's still a ton to get to. Thank you so much for listening to the show, as ever. Glorfin David, Galadriel, thank you so much for, as Galadriel says, a bit of an extension wouldn't bother me. I am beset on all sides by people who want me to take longer in these sessions. I don't know what to do about that. I think some kind of new Tolkien show where I do nothing but talk about this stuff week in, week out, until I, too, am withered and aged as a mortal man like Gwyndor, having faced the torment of Angband. I'm not that far away from that now, let's be honest. That's going to do it for this week's session. I will be back on Thursday. That is, let me check my notes and figure out the actual date. Is that the 5th? That is, in fact, the 5th. The 5th, this coming Thursday evening, 9 p.m. Central Time, will be our concluding session. We have to make it through the end of Túrin Turambar in that session. Otherwise, there is no hope for us at all. David, Becky, thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening to those of you at home. If you would like links to the live session, if you want to come out and hang out with me, yes, but to a much greater extent, hang out with Galadriel and Glorfin David, who are excellent, then you can head on over to patreon.com/nextword, where you will find the links. You can sign up there for free. And you will find the links each week to the live video session, so you can come and hang out in the chat room, and also encourage me to take more time to cover the Silmarillion. That is going to do it for this week's show. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me. I will talk